This program contains scenes that have been dramatized, with special attention given to historical accuracy. When the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, they go deep into the shadows to fight back.
The U.S. government's initial reaction was very swift.
We were going to give it everything we had, one last push.
A huge covert action program to help drive the Soviets out.
While future enemies lurk nearby, these undercover shadow warriors will take on a communist superpower on one of history's harshest battlefields.
We have an opportunity to really punish the Soviets. They have made a rare mistake, and a mistake of large proportions.
Go win this thing.
December 24th, 1979. When Soviet troops invade Afghanistan, the Cold War suddenly becomes hot. Caught by surprise, U.S. officials worry the Soviets will continue their march into the territory of American allies. The Central Intelligence Agency is immediately directed to begin a covert action program to beat back the communists.
Jimmy Carter issued a secret presidential finding shortly after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and he directed CIA to go ahead and use all means to help the Afghans resist this.
We're basically facing a country with nuclear weapon that could destroy the United States 1,000 times over, and that country was very unstable.
Milt Bearden, a career undercover operative, is head of the CIA cell in Pakistan. Here, Bearden and his team will launch a campaign to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan and end the Cold War once and for all. A legendary figure among his colleagues, Bearden is ideally suited for the job.
He's a charismatic, larger-than-life figure who loved to operate, loved to be out in the field, liked to really push the envelope of what he was doing.
Milt at the time was greater than life. Nobody comes close.
Bearden's team will work secretly out of the American embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan. The CIA station is a hand-picked group of some of the best officers in American intelligence.
I kept it small. You don't want something big. The Pentagon always wanted to run this thing, and they were thinking in terms of about a battalion of Americans. That's like 500 people. I tried to do it with a handful.
Another CIA intelligence cell will join Bearden's team. Their leader is Gary Schroen, a CIA officer with years of experience in the Middle East.
He is a truly remarkable American, and I think someone who has on many more than one occasion risked his life to further American interests.
CIA officers are a special breed, able to disappear quickly, assume a disguise, and gain the trust of those they recruit to spy for them.
You look for people who can get around the diplomatic circuit, can mix it up with foreign diplomats on a social basis, establish contacts, develop friendships, and those kinds of things that allow them to have access to people that they really want to eventually recruit.
You can't really trust anybody. And even your close friends who are outside the agency, you can't really tell them what you do.
Working cover jobs by day, the CIA officers wait to do their real work under the cover of darkness.
Usually, a case officer would meet his agent at night, after hours, because it would be less prying eyes.
Summer 1985. Bearden and his team methodically gather intelligence about the Soviets' weaknesses inside Afghanistan, where several tribal groups of Afghans known as the Mujahideen resist the invasion. Rugged but disorganized, the Mujahideen are fighting for their homeland.
A couple 100,000 full and part-time fighters. They had their own rhythm of war, and we had to learn to adapt to that. As a fighter, he does it his way, not ours.
And Mujahideen, they were ready to fight in all sides, in all ways. Every single Afghan wanted to fight the Soviets and kill the Soviets, the invaders.
With the Mujahideen, America sees an opportunity to push back the Russians and perhaps cripple the Soviet Union once and for all.
We have an opportunity here to really punish the Soviets. They have made a rare mistake, and a mistake of large proportions. And we ought to rush in to Afghanistan and make sure that they pay as high a price as possible for this error.
The CIA officers must be careful to operate under deep secrecy and not alert the Russian intelligence service, the KGB, of their intentions to support the Afghan resistance.
The Russian KGB was very aggressive at watching our officers and all the American embassy officers, arresting any Afghans who happened to be seen with dealing with Americans.
January 1980. As Russian troops expand their movement into Afghanistan, the CIA sends the first shipments of weapons and supplies to the Mujahideen. The assistance does little to repel the Soviets.
These were initially very light weapons chosen so that it wouldn't be apparent to anyone that the CIA had paid for them. The first guns they purchased were old Lee Enfield colonial rifles, single-shot rifles really of 60 years or more vintage.
Mauser rifles and things left over from World War II, if not earlier.
The weapons and ammunition provided by the CIA travel a long, arduous route into Afghanistan.
Some of it would be ships on the high sea or C-5As bringing stuff in.
Then they're broken down, and you'll see the small Toyota pickup trucks. And we probably had the largest Toyota dealership in Southeast Asia at that time.
And then ultimately onto the backs of a mule.
You have to go over those god-awful rugged hills of Afghanistan, and you need mules.
So I bought all the mules that could be made in China, mules that were made in parts of Africa.
The mules are perfect for transporting heavy loads of guns and ammo through the mountainous battle zones of Afghanistan. In addition to military ordnance, the CIA also begins to send in shipments of money to the Mujahideen commanders.
We wanted to support the commanders who did most of the fightings. We supported them on a monthly basis, so we had a certain amount of money per month. Whatever I had could have had me killed very easily.
Some of them I paid a good deal of money to make sure that they would feel it's in their interest to tell me the truth.
The money was meant to put an army in the field, to pay for food and weaponry, ammunition, to pay off villagers, to pay bribes.
But the money and outdated weapons are no match for the Soviet army, which soon controls much of the country. The Soviet soldiers develop a reputation for brutality and begin to launch targeted assassinations of resistance commanders at refugee camps inside Pakistan.
There were a number of assassinations inside Pakistan in these refugee camps where the Afghan communists were reaching out to get and kill Mujahideen figures, political figures, or people in the refugee camps who they considered to be a threat.
But the Mujahideen refuse to be eradicated. The Russians are attempting to occupy a country that has never suffered under foreign rule for long. The Russian soldiers soon learn this.
It was a brutal war in just about every respect. In their memoirs and in the stories they've told as veterans, there's a sense familiar from the experiences of other armies of occupation of just pervasive fear, suspicion, and an attitude of we had better shoot first because the alternative is that they'll get us. And so this contributed to a culture of brutality among the Soviet forces that was exacerbated by a breakdown in discipline on the front lines.
As the vicious war slogs on, the Mujahideen are getting low on weapons. The CIA has more advanced weaponry available, but is wary of tipping their hand to Moscow. If the Soviets learn of America's secret involvement in Afghanistan, it could escalate into nuclear war.
The CIA faced a turning point, and the question was, are we now prepared to supply weapons that it will be obvious came from us?
Kabul, 1986. The Soviet Union rules Afghanistan through fear and brutality. The Afghan resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen are losing the war. Struggling to turn the tide, the CIA must decide which is riskier, provoking the nuclear-armed Soviets or conceding defeat.
President Reagan had decided that this was turning into some sort of a stalemate where the Afghans couldn't win. They would just continue to bleed the Soviets, but in the process of bleeding the Soviets, they had already given up 1 million dead Afghans, 1.5 million wounded, and 5 million had been driven into exile.
There was a decision, collective decision made in Washington at the policy level that we wanted to really ratchet up the effort. So we enlarged the staff both in Washington and in the field.
Spring 1986. CIA officer Milt Bearden meets with agency director William Casey and learns of a new covert task force that will expand America's support for the Mujahideen.
The head of the Afghan task force was a man named Jack Devine, who was very cautious. And Jack was probably the perfect guy to run the task force from Washington because he understood the political dynamics.
There was an effort to make known to them that we were really pushing hard and that they were going to have difficulty.
So Bill Casey's instructions to me were, let's try to go win it, actually win it. I think he had a plan in his own head that involved a variety of hot buttons that he would be using to keep forcing the Soviet Union into a deeper, deeper pit. Try to come up with ways that you can make every day a terrible day for the Soviets, to torment them to where, as their leaders began to discuss with our leaders the prospect of ending this war and reaching an agreement.
To better fight such a ruthless enemy, the CIA first teaches the Mujahideen how to sabotage the Soviets.
Well, one of the other aspects of this whole overall program was to try to cripple the Russian equipment.
Remote-controlled bombs, time devices, and occasionally even car bombs and briefcase bombs to try to assassinate the Soviet leadership inside the capital of Kabul.
So there were a lot of these kind of sabotage, quick hit-and-run raids.
Things like dams, power pylons, power lines, power generation plants, infrastructure targets, bridges, that kind of thing.
One of the CIA tools of sabotage is a special timer used to set off bombs.
The CIA supplied a device that was commonly called a pencil timer, which was simply a chemical delay timer that could be installed in an explosive device by a guerrilla who would leave the device and then retreat, and the chemical burn would be predictable to a certain time, and then whether it was a half an hour or 6 hours later, the device would explode.
As huge shipments of American aid flows to the Mujahideen, Bearden's team struggles to get good information about the impact the money and weapons are making on the actual battlefield.
Until the CIA began to recruit its own agents in the late 80s, it had to rely almost entirely on Pakistani intelligence for reports about how the war was going.
To reduce visibility, the CIA has been directing the Afghan resistance through Pakistan's intelligence service. Now, Bearden decides to directly recruit new spies from among the Mujahideen commanders.
Americans were cultivating sources of their own. CIA was spending a lot of money, and subsequently they got directly in touch with many of the commanders.
We wanted to develop our own source of information about the war in Afghanistan, to debrief them directly as opposed to going through the Pakistanis.
Show us battle damage reports. Show us how many aircraft are down. Who's stealing our money? Who's selling arms in the marketplace?
The direct recruiting of spies will pose enormous dangers for both Bearden's team and their prospective Mujahideen agents.
And it's a difficult task. There's a huge moral obligation because you can't have a bad day and get a little sloppy and get some guy rolled up, because the next stop for him is the basement of a shooting prison where his life ends very abruptly.
January 1986. Gary Schroen and his colleagues arrange a huge handoff of hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash to the Mujahideen leaders.
You were always very, very careful with the money. We primarily used a van with a side door that would slide open and time it so that we met our Mujahideen contact. The two vehicles pull up. Myself and two other guys were pulling money out of our van, tossing it into the Mujahideen truck. We was doing it in a hurry. Everybody was, like, let's get going, move it, move it, move it. And so as they shut the door, we drive off, they drive off.
Inside the van of Mujahideen fighters, a commander notices something is missing and begins to harass Schroen's Mujahideen agent, who helped arrange the drop.
The guy in the back says, we only have 3 bags of money in the car. So my friend thinks, oh, they think I'm cheating them. They're gonna accuse me if we're shortchanging the amount. So he's just starting to sweat bullets because these guys would have killed him if they thought he had stolen a bag of their money. So he turns around and drives back, and luckily, there sitting in the middle of the road was the 4th duffel bag. And so he was begging me, said, the next time, Gary, please, let's count the bags as we can put them in the vehicle. I don't want to die out here.
With life or death stakes, undercover CIA officers must live in a world of secrets and lies, which they are not allowed to share with anyone.
And we couldn't talk about our work to our spouses. They knew generally what we were doing, that we were going elsewhere to meet people, so they had some ideas. But they really did not know the details. And this type of secrecy, the lack of intimacy, and then the lack of time spent together often leads to friction between couples.
In addition to keeping distant from their families and friends, the CIA officers can't always trust their spies.
It's really very hard not to trust people.
But you never knew that if his organization had slipped or been infiltrated, or someone in the organization would know that there was a large amount of money coming and try to intercept you on your way to the house.
The line between friend and enemy easily blurs. After a failed attempt to double-cross the CIA, a Mujahideen commander named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar puts out a bounty on the life of an undercover agent, codenamed Bulldog.
Hekmatyar put a price on my head. My wife had to be evacuated early. I stayed around because I had to finish the job. That was basically the final straw for her, and she basically told me, well, you have to choose, it's me or it's the agency. And I'm not proud to say that I think I made the wrong choice at the time. So I decided to stay with the agency.
Alone, Bulldog continues to work with his spies, but around Islamabad keeps a watchful eye.
From that time on, my surveillance detection routes were a little bit longer. Made sure that I varied my pattern, even going to the embassy from my home.
The CIA officers continue to supply the Mujahideen with new machine guns and bags full of cash. But as the war drags on, it never seems to be enough. Moscow has redoubled its efforts to exterminate the Mujahideen. The resistance is waning, and the Soviets are growing more and more powerful in the country. June 1986, Afghanistan. Soviet tanks under heavy armor roll through the Afghan countryside, decimating the ranks of the Mujahideen resistance fighters. The Afghan fighters' outdated rifles and rockets are no match for the tanks. The CIA decides it must equip the Mujahideen with more sophisticated weaponry.
A terrific French-built Milan missile, wire-guided, that gives you 3 kilometers to reach out and guide this missile in onto a tank or an armored personnel carrier and kill it. And so what you've done is given an Afghan 10 times the reach.
The Mujahideen quickly adapt to the new wire-guided missile, forcing the Soviet tanks to withdraw into the cities of Afghanistan.
So instead of some 20-year-old Afghan standing with an RPG on his shoulder looking at a 64-ton tank and then doing a Dodge City or OK Corral with him and getting killed in the process, somebody can kind of quietly hunker down and fire this missile off and guide it right in at 3,000 meters, and that's a huge, huge step forward.
Another advance for the Mujahideen is the arrival of reinforcements, volunteers from Islamic countries that have answered the call to jihad.
The Arab volunteers began to arrive in small numbers at the beginning of the war, and their numbers and their role grew as the war developed.
Afghans are willing to fight to the death, but their desire is to die in bed at an old age when the Lord calls them home. So the Arabs came there to die. They were more than willing to charge into Soviet machine gun posts. They came there to become martyrs.
One of the leaders among the Arab fighters is a wealthy young Saudi named Osama bin Laden.
In 88 and 89, bin Laden's name began to appear in our operational traffic. We were getting reports from our Afghan Mujahideen friends that there was this Saudi fellow named bin Laden who was a very wealthy guy related to some big family in Saudi Arabia.
He had deep pockets. He showed up in soft leather shoes. He was a man who carried an air of wealth about him, and he was generous. He handed out funds at hospitals.
His work was mostly concerned with providing humanitarian aid to the Mujahideen in terms of food and shelter.
Bin Laden quickly expands his role in the jihad.
By the mid to late 80s, he began to do more than just hand out cash. He started to build things. Along the border where the key supply routes ran, he began to construct with imported bulldozers and other equipment a kind of border infrastructure that would create secure depots, supplies, hospitals, and camps.
While the CIA had been heavily equipping and funding the Mujahideen, they say they avoided bin Laden and his fellow Arab fighters.
While he was there, during the Mujahideen struggle with the Russians, aid that the U.S. provided went to the Afghan forces, not to the Arab forces.
We never had any contact. We never came close to having any contact. We didn't circulate in the same circles.
The bottom line is they hated the Americans as much as they hated the Soviets.
Even with the influx of Arab fighters onto the battlefield, the Mujahideen are still outnumbered and under-equipped. Large groups of Russian ground forces roam the countryside, nearly impervious to the Mujahideen's small-scale attacks. But the CIA finds a weakness in the Soviet ground forces for them to exploit.
Afghanistan is a very mountainous and rugged country where, even in the best of times, it's difficult to move from one place to another on the ground.
The Soviet troop movements are slow, requiring them to group together at bases in the countryside. These well-guarded bases are virtually impregnable, until CIA officer Milt Bearden teaches the Mujahideen a new way to strike.
We bought 120 millimeter mortars, which is a huge mortar, powerful.
This is a big, cumbersome, heavy weapon. It takes a lot of men and pack mules to move it around. But if you set up 4 or 5 of them, you can just devastate a target in a very short time.
The earth just rattles when it hits.
The CIA trains the Mujahideen to precision target the Soviet camps using satellites.
We could send a team with these mortars out They go query the satellite, say, where am I? And it comes back and says, you're at, and gives a series of numbers that puts it right down to a spot on the Earth that's very small.
The satellite targeting provided by the CIA allows the Mujahideen to fire large mortar rounds directly into the Soviet Army camps from a safe distance. Soon, the first satellite mortar team deploys in the Chargasarai Valley, home to a large battalion of Soviet Special Forces. They
had barracks, they had everything. This was their safe haven.
The satellite mortar team sets up their weapons, acquire their targets, and fire 5 mortar rounds. But something has gone wrong.
4 of the mortar tubes fired as they were supposed to. The 5th one exploded, burst itself into shrapnel, killed a couple of the crewmen, and badly wounded one of our Pakistani colleagues, literally almost blowing off his mandible. Okay.
In the fog of war, one of the Mujahideen mortar gunners has made a fatal mistake.
A nervous gunner had heard the order, load your tubes, put a mortar tube down in there. Didn't thought for a second. I said, did I do that? And he said, no, I didn't. And he double fed the mortar tube.
The CIA investigates and prepares the team for another attack.
So we went right back, and the guys at Chargasarai were still camped around there.
The team sneaks back into position and again acquires their targets.
And then the mortars all went in, talked to our satellites, lined everything up. And smoked this Soviet Spetsnaz battalion.
As the mortar team retreats back to the Mujahideen camps in Pakistan, Milt Bearden waits at the embassy to see images of the attack.
And when our satellites went over the next day, they took a look. There was total devastation of a battalion, just knocked out. Everything burned out.
The Soviet Special Forces and ground troops are quickly decimated by the mortar attacks.
It became extremely perilous for the Soviets and their Afghan partners to try to move on the ground.
With their tanks and ground forces severely weakened, the Soviets searched for a new way to attack the Mujahideen.
They couldn't stop the CIA supply line coming across the border from Pakistan. So in the mid to late 80s, they developed a plan to try to shut the border off.
August 1986. A new lethal group of highly trained Soviet fighters enters Afghanistan. Their target? The supply lines of the Mujahideen. The Soviets plan to crush the resistance and end the war once and for all. Afghanistan, August 1986. The Soviet Union's tanks and ground forces have been weakened by the Afghan rebels. But a new group of highly trained and effective Soviet special forces called the Spetsnaz are brought in to crush the resistance. Using helicopters, they regularly attack the Mujahideen supply lines between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
The Soviets would violate Pakistani sovereignty and fly over the border to get behind supply lines and come flying right up behind a group of rebels and attack and kill them.
One of the things that the Soviets had, and the true advantage over the Mujahideen, was their air power. Their MiG aircraft could take a devastating toll on the Mujahideen anytime they gathered in anything but very small groups.
CIA officer Gary Schroen becomes the target of one such Soviet air raid.
There was a standing rule that CIA officers were not to actually enter Afghanistan, but on special circumstances it could happen. Once I wanted to go in to visit with a Mujahideen radio station that we had paid for.
Schroen and a CIA colleague visit the radio station to help the Mujahideen broadcast anti-Soviet propaganda into Afghanistan.
And we were going to move to a new place where there was another transmitter when the first one of these 240 millimeter Soviet rocket came blasting into the valley. And our host said, "You guys have got to leave. They know you're here."
The two officers are barraged by Soviet gunship fire.
And so as we drove out, rockets were exploding behind us, and kind of almost as if they were following us down the road. Rocks rolling down the hillside as we drove away.
The CIA officers escape unscathed, but with first-hand proof of Soviet air superiority over Afghanistan. Raining death from on high, Soviet fighters not only attack Mujahideen military targets, but ruthlessly target Afghan civilians.
Bombing refugee camps, destroying meeting places of civilians.
Soviets bombarded all the villages. The Soviet plane crossed the borders and attacked some refugee camps.
The new campaign by the Soviets to demoralize the resistance is working. There is simply no way for the CIA and the Mujahideen to win without controlling the skies above Afghanistan.
They decided to hunker down and wait to get martyred. The Soviets controlled the air to such an extent that every time the Mujahideen put their head up, these squadrons of Mi-24 helicopters would really knock them down, and nothing would bring them down except a lucky shot. And so the Stinger was the last hope.
Stinger is a fire-and-forget guided missile which can destroy low-level aircraft.
The Stinger missile is a heat-seeking shoulder-fired rocket, specially designed to take out jets and helicopters. It is the one weapon that could turn the tide of the war. But it has never been fired in combat.
It's a heat-seeking missile. It's a fire-and-forget missile in the sense that when you aim it, you lock on the target, fire the missile, and that's the end of it. There's no guiding. There's really nothing left for the operator to do except shout, "God is great," after the missile hits the target.
It's really quite an amazing weapon. Fire it off to the right and it feels the heat of the helicopter off to the left, and it'll turn and make a right turn or left turn and go after the helicopter.
September 1986. The CIA recruits a special team of Mujahideen to train on the Stinger missile.
They got the best fighters they could find. It's an honor to have that weapon.
The carefully chosen Stinger missile team will learn to operate the weapon at a secret location.
They were brought to a secret training facility in Rawalpindi, Pakistan.
We used a classroom with sheets hung at the end of the classroom, the windows blacked out, terrain painted on, sort of like a fourth grade school scene. Stinger gunners would go through the arming procedure. They would first acquire that infrared target. And once they acquired that, there would be a little vibration against their cheek.
Once the Stinger starts to vibrate, the target has been acquired and the missile is ready to be fired. Late September 1986, after weeks of training, the first Stinger missile team is ready to launch its first attack.
The first team we dispatched was a team led by an engineer who'd actually had some training in the Soviet Union.
The Mujahideen engineer goes by a secret name to protect his identity, Ghaffar.
Which is one of the 99 names of Allah when it means the forgiver.
September 25th, 1986. Ghaffar and his men travel with their Stinger missiles to a Soviet airbase outside of Jalalabad. The airbase is home to dozens of Soviet helicopters and MiG fighters that have been relentlessly attacking the Mujahideen for the last 6 years.
They got themselves set up a few kilometers off of the runway at Jalalabad, and we were aware that a flight of Soviet Mi-24 helicopters was coming in from Kabul late that afternoon. And sure enough, they showed up, and Ghafar's team was there. The lead pilots more or less brought the group right over our hidden team.
As 7 helicopters approach the Mujahideen Stinger team, They carefully aim their missiles.
If you're in a helicopter and you look down the ground, it's very hard to see a few people in the bush. But the Mujahideen, being courageous warriors, did not want to fire from behind a rock. Shooters stood up in plain sight.
Ghaffar acquired the lead helicopter on his Stinger, and it gave the vibration on his cheek. And at the right moment, as he was trained, he squeezed off the first Stinger ever fired in anger in the world. And then the rocket engine catches on and whoom. But this one went out of the tube and then just fell about 15 feet out and clattered along in the rocks. And it was one of the biggest, oh God, it's in the war. But it was a failure, it was a dud.
The Stinger team quickly regroups.
The second gunner, though, had also acquired a helicopter. And just as Ghaffar was standing there looking at this thing kind of bouncing around in the rocks saying, what have they given me now? The other gunner fired.
He yelled Allah Akbar and pulled the trigger and fired.
As the Stinger missile rockets through the air towards the Soviet helicopter, the fate of the war hangs in the balance. September 25th, 1986, Jalalabad, Afghanistan. To fight back against the Soviet helicopters terrorizing their country, the CIA has equipped Afghan resistance fighters with the highly classified Stinger missile. Outside a Soviet airbase, a small group of Mujahideen have launched the first Stinger attack of the war, misfiring on their first attempt. But now, a second Stinger missile rockets through the air, directly towards a Soviet helicopter.
And that white tail arced across sort of this blue, cobalt blue sky of eastern Afghanistan and popped that helicopter. And it felt like a rock right at the end of the runway.
5 other Soviet choppers break formation, scrambling to escape. But the Stinger team has been trained well by the CIA, and its leader, the engineer Ghaffar, is ready to attack again.
Ghaffar acquired a second helicopter, brought it down as well. And they dropped them all right there like rocks.
And you see them moving across the countryside, and they come to the wreckage, and the pilot's there dead, and his body is in pieces, and they're going Allahu Akbar, they're jumping around.
They realized that they had accomplished something that up until now had not been feasible, and that was to stop those fearsome helicopters.
Milt Bearden notifies CIA headquarters in Washington of the first Stinger attack.
I got word that night that they brought this down and sent the cable off to headquarters and said, you know, our first team reports 3 kills outside in Jalalabad.
In Washington, Jack Devine is waiting for further proof of the Stinger attack.
We were lucky enough to pick up the photography, the imagery of the shoot-downs. It was a stunning moment. It was a historical moment. I called immediately for an appointment and got one to see Casey.
Devine takes the satellite photos to the director of the CIA, William Casey.
Immediately, he saw the significance of it. This looks like the beginning of the end. Everybody that touched it sensed it.
The Soviets immediately changed their tactics.
The Soviets shut down Jalalabad airfield, sent down an inspection team to find out what the hell this was. And they said, okay, here it is. Stinger's come to war.
The greater the number of Afghan Air Force planes that were hit and brought down, the more reluctant the Afghan Air Force was to fly combat missions, and the Soviets in turn would have to fly more combat missions. And the more they flew, the more they were shot down.
The Stinger missiles forced Soviet pilots to fly at much higher altitudes.
Their bombing was less effective, they couldn't get down on the ground, and they were really terrified of this new weapon.
The armaments and equipment poured across the border where it had been bottlenecked for several months. The Russians knew it. It was tremendously demoralizing.
After years of war, the tide has finally turned.
What the Stinger did was energize a resistance movement of a couple 100,000 guys. From the first kill, the war turned.
The momentum had unquestionably moved in our favor.
And from then there was no turning back for either the Mujahideen or Mikhail Gorbachev.
And I think they went back to Moscow and began to plan how are we getting out of this seemingly unending mess that we gotten ourselves into.
And so it just kept going and going and going until in April of 1988 the Soviets signed in Geneva and said we're out of here. And we'll be out by the 15th of February 1989. Everybody in Washington and Islamabad starting to make bets, oh, they'll never make it, they'll never do it.
November 1988. The Soviets live up to their word, withdrawing in the same manner as they arrived, through a narrow passage in northern Afghanistan.
They never missed a beat. They were out of there.
February 15th, 1989. The last Russian tank, carrying the last Russian soldier, prepares to leave Afghanistan across the Friendship Bridge.
And here comes this tank, and it stops in the middle of the bridge, and a skinny 14-year-old kid starts walking towards the tank, and he's carrying roses in his arms.
After 9 years of conflict and hundreds of thousands dead, the Soviet Union has been dealt a crippling defeat.
The General Boris Gromov gets out of the tank, jumps down and kind of straightens his tunic out and walks to his son and takes this bouquet of roses. And together they walk off the bridge.
Goal was done, mission accomplished. And I heard that they had a party back at headquarters.
Most of the diplomatic personnel meet at the embassy in Pakistan to celebrate.
I don't remember that. I remember being by myself that evening, drinking a bottle of champagne by myself, and there was no one to share it with. So that probably was the proudest moment I had, but it was a bittersweet moment.
The CIA officers enjoy their victory alone. They are shadow warriors, and their great triumph over America's greatest enemy cannot yet see the light of day. The news of the Soviet withdrawal reaches the rest of the world, and soon other countries begin their own battles to expel the Soviet Union.
All through that summer, the people in East Germany began to go out on the streets. And by November, the Berlin Wall was breached, and that was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. 45-year Cold War. We lost $13 trillion, 100,000 dead in Korea and Vietnam, and it was over, done.
But the country of Afghanistan, left to its own devices, quickly falls into chaos. A few years later, the Taliban will come to power, and Osama bin Laden will return to Afghanistan to plot against America.
By abandoning it in the 90s, it cost, certainly us later, it cost the United States this new war we're in because we allowed the state to fail.
America dropped Afghanistan like a hot brick. That was a great classic betrayal.
But for now, the CIA's shadow warriors are victorious. With the help of the CIA, the Mujahideen have liberated their country from the Soviets.
These people, these Afghans, have always done one thing very well. They've dealt with whoever it is that makes that first big mistake by coming into their country. And they understand that whoever comes in there ultimately wishes they hadn't, because nobody else ever stayed, ever. They always leave, and leave them to their own devices, sooner or later.